Vladimir Putin is not planning to stop the war in 2026 and has instead ordered the Russian army to increase the pace of the offensive next year. Putin gathered the board of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation today, where together with Defense Minister Belousov, he summed up the results of the war in 2025. And right away he called on Russian soldiers to keep dying in Ukraine next year as well. So Putin stated that in 2026 it is necessary to increase the pace of the offensive in Ukraine in order to capture more territories. Putin directly stated that despite all attempts to reach a peace agreement, Russia plans to continue the war until 2030. And not only to capture territories but also to create a so-called buffer zone. In addition, Putin is preparing an offensive against NATO countries under the pretext that it is NATO preparing to attack Russia. Putin stated today that it was not Russia apparently that attacked Ukraine in 2022, but that the West started a war against Russia. And in addition to all this, Putin announced that he will put the Oreshnik missile system on combat duty by the end of this year. But the most interesting thing is that Putin spoke about a possible war between Russia and Europe. The dictator said that he is not going to negotiate peace with the current authorities in Europe. First comes war, then a change in political elites, followed by dialogue. Overall, Europeans are right when they say that Europe needs to prepare for a big war, since Putin doesn't even hide the fact that he doesn't want any peace. Meanwhile, American representatives continue to pressure Ukraine to give up our territories to Putin. My name is Pechiy. Let's discuss this topic together, but before we start, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a detailed comment below. This really helps a lot in promoting the episodes on YouTube, and I would be grateful to you for that. Also, subscribe to my Telegram channel Pechiy News, the link is in the description of this video. There, we post breaking news as it comes in. So today, the balding dictator Vladimir Putin and his subordinate, the Russian Defense Minister Belousov, gathered the board of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation to sum up the results of the war this year and to plan for the war next year. And, you know, if you set aside all this propaganda nonsense about Ukraine supposedly losing 1.5 million people and military equipment, attention, they claim we supposedly lost as many as 215,000 units. The main message from Putin is that he has no intention of stopping the war. Today, at the meeting of the Ministry of Defense Board, Putin and Belousov announced their military plans for 2026 and up to 2030. And next year Putin intends only to increase the pace of the offensive. And here I'll quote Belousov. That is, Belousov is directly saying that Russians will continue to fight and don't care. They didn't care about Donald Trump's attempts with his peace initiatives. And I'm not saying this to scare anyone, but so that finally all the illusions that exist even among Ukrainian citizens will disappear. Donald Trump's peace plan, which involves handing over territory to Putin without a fight, will not stop this war, because the enemy is preparing to keep fighting. And Putin is now saying that if the West does not agree to all of the Kremlin's conditions, he is ready to keep fighting. Quote, "If the West refuses to talk, Russia will achieve the liberation of its historical lands by military means. The task of creating and expanding a buffer security zone in Ukraine will be consistently pursued," says Putin. There's your answer. Until Putin is forced to stop by force, no concessions like a piece of Donbass or anything else will stop him. At the meeting today, they and Belousov openly said they plan to keep fighting. And it's also worth noting separately that Putin is clearly preparing for a war with NATO as well. Putin told the unwashed Russians about how NATO countries are actively building up and modernizing their offensive forces, creating and deploying new types of weapons, including in outer space and in Europe. According to Putin, at the same time people are being instilled with fears about an inevitable confrontation with Russia and preparations for a great war. And then, quoting Putin, he has repeatedly said, "This is a lie, nonsense, just nonsense about some imaginary Russian threat to European countries." And here I urge you not to fall for the lies of the Kremlin ghoul. It said the same thing before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The balding dictator Putin and his entire entourage also insisted in 2022 that it was all nonsense and lies. Unfortunately, we know what happened later. But Putin himself also mentioned another important detail, which for me personally became final proof that Putin is ready to go to war with Europe. Here, listen carefully. Putin falsely claimed that supposedly Russia stands for building mutually beneficial and equal cooperation with the United States of America and European countries, for creating a unified security system throughout the entire Eurasian region. Putin stated that, quote, Russia has always, even in the most difficult circumstances, so to speak, until the very end, wherever there was even the slightest chance, tried to find diplomatic solutions to disagreements and conflicts. And the responsibility for the fact that these chances were not used lies entirely with those who believed that they could speak to us in the language of force. With these unwashed, uneducated, savage Russians, that's the only way to talk to them. And then Putin called on European voters to support right-wing parties, right-wing and left-wing populists who have long been nurtured by the Kremlin. Putin continues to exploit the fear of war among the European population and called on Europeans to support ultra-right and ultra-left populists, with whom, supposedly, it would be easier to negotiate. Well, that's what he calls a change of political elites. Once again, Putin is calling on Europeans to overthrow their governments and elect those that will be beneficial and convenient for the Kremlin. You know what that's called? An infringement on sovereignty. But this is a telling moment, because before the full-scale war against Ukraine, Putin also called for supporting various pro-Russian forces in Ukraine, with whom he supposedly would find it easier to negotiate. When that didn't happen, Russia attacked. Moreover, let me remind you how Kremlin baldy Putin, in the first days of the full-scale war, publicly called on the soldiers of the armed forces of Ukraine to overthrow the government and sit down at the negotiating table with these savage Russians. And now Putin is saying exactly the same thing to Europe. Next, another quote from Putin. It is unlikely that it will be possible to reach an agreement and resolve issues peacefully with the current political elites of Europe, but in any case, this will inevitably happen as we continue to grow stronger. If not with current politicians, then when Europe's political elites change? So Putin is directly saying with the current authorities, we won't negotiate peacefully. He thinks it's impossible, while Donald Trump's team responds, no, what are you talking about? Putin wants peace. Putin is looking for every way to somehow end the war. But Putin is saying directly, listen, yes, I'm not going to negotiate anything with you. And apparently, so that Europeans would get scared and rush to overthrow their governments, and Russian guys would be more willing to go die on Ukrainian soil. For Putin's regime, the dictator started to praise and consider modernizing the Russian armed forces. Putin said that by the end of the year, a medium-range missile system with the Oreshnik hypersonic missile will be put on combat duty. Well, I just want to say, and if it doesn't happen, what will you do, Baldy? I'm ready to stand by my words, but it's important to note that this was said by the same dictator who has already claimed to capture Kupiansk about 15 times. Today they again reported Kupiansk was taken. Victory. Just yesterday they claimed the same, forgetting they've already captured it 15 times. And one more important point that Europeans should pay attention to, Putin is preparing for war with NATO and understands that strikes will also hit Russia. Therefore, when announcing plans to modernize the Russian armed forces, Putin stated that Russia plans to strengthen its air defense and missile defense systems, electronic warfare control systems, and unmanned complexes. Putin once again threatened the world with a nuclear strike. What else is new? And finally, I'll add one more important thought. Russia doesn't need any peace negotiations. Russia is simply stalling for time because it hopes that Ukraine will just wear out and break first. Today, Belousov said this directly at the Russian Ministry of Defense board meeting. The strategy is that Russia is simply trying to minimize the damage from Western sanctions by convincing Donald Trump that all Russia needs is Donbass. Putin wants peace, but Ukraine is resisting. Well, just listen to what the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, Belousov, is saying today, and I hope everything will become clear to you right away. Here's the quote. In the end, what was clear from the start was confirmed. The collapse of Ukraine's defense is inevitable, and even Kiev's Western backers know this. Ukrainian statehood is falling apart. You can see it by the golden toilets, and the armed forces are also degrading. In other words, it's a sign that if we keep fighting another year or two, they'll completely collapse. That's why our task is to buy time, to please Donald Trump, and to keep telling him that Putin wants peace and so on and so forth. Meanwhile, continue the war. And finally, I'll just voice my personal wish to Donald Trump's administration. Stop being so naive. Putin doesn't want any peace. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. And friends, if you found this episode interesting and useful, you can support the work of this channel with your donation or a paid sponsorship subscription by following the links and payment details. In the description of this video, it says support Alexei Pechiy's channel, and below you'll find all the payment details and all the links. Choose any format that's convenient for you. I will be grateful for any support from you. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.